Oh, hello there. I am your spring fairy here to bring you your spring book recommendation guide. I have all the books that will get you ready for the spring months, and even if it's chilly where you are, this will definitely warm you up. So let's see what we have to read. Hi guys, it's Amy and welcome to the channel, or welcome back. I hope that you're doing well. Let me know how you're doing in the comments below, and I am so glad to be back in front of the camera, back in front of the bookshelves. I have definitely missed you guys and just getting to chat books with you. I've been trying to keep up with you guys on my posts and community tab, and of course on my other social media, but I know it's just not quite the same without the main YouTube videos. I am back. I have been just dealing with health stuff. If you have been around, you know I deal with chronic illness. I've been trying some new medications, just different things, and it kind of threw me for a loop. So that's just kind of where we're at. And with that, I wasn't really able to read that much during the month of February. So I am not going to do a February reading wrap up. I think I might do a February, March kind of sandwiched together at the end of March. So we are going to be getting into these spring book recommendations. And as I said, I am the spring fairy today. I've got my crown. This is from me doing a fairy for a pop culture convention near where I live. And I never get to wear it, so I thought it would be perfect for today. I've got my spring earrings, and I hope this isn't too girly or anything, but I am just trying to channel the vibes of spring for me. So when I think of spring books, I have a few different kind of themes and topics in mind. I definitely think of fresh takes on stories, so maybe retellings or just kind of a new take on a classic sort of story. Definitely hopeful beginnings. We're thinking of things budding and blooming, and that definitely is, evoking that sort of feeling where we're starting new journeys and there's just a lot of hope centered in it. And then, of course, love is in the air. I think, springtime, the birds and the bees are out and that sort of thing. And then, of course, it wouldn't be me without a little bit of dismantling hate and corruption, a little bit of bringing down corrupt politics and things like that. So that is a year-round thing. But there's hopeful beginnings in that as well. But I am excited to talk about these books. I've got a pretty extensive list for you today, but I think you're going to really enjoy it. I've got high fantasy, cozy fantasy, romance, fantasy romance, and even a little bit of poetry in there. So let's get into this pretty epic list. I'm going to try to go through these quickly, so I'm just going to give a little bit of blurb of why I think these are spring oriented. And first up is our high fantasy recommendations, and that starts with the Tide Child trilogy by R.J. Barker. This feels like spring to me in that it is kind of hopeful beginnings and trying to dismantle this sort of corrupt system, but it's pirates, it's on the high seas. It is definitely a found family sort of thing. It definitely is a fresh take on a pirate story, and definitely hopeful beginnings. And this really is just a series that blew me away when I read it last summer. And it's a trilogy that just gets better with each book. And I know we can't always say that about series, but this one definitely, it just gets better and better, and I'm so glad to see it get more hype online. My next pick is a very underrated book, and it is Crueler Mercies by Maren Chase. This is kind of a very loose Rapunzel retelling, but it is dark, it is grim, but it is definitely filled with bringing down corruption, hopeful beginnings. There's some sapphic romance in there. It is such an epic book. It definitely gets a little bit dark as far as dealing with mental health and the just grueling parts of war. It definitely doesn't glorify war. I really appreciate how it handles that. It is just such a fantastic book, and I definitely love the FMC. She really just goes on this journey of finding herself and really seeing the value in herself, but we're bringing down the the corrupt government and patriarchy and all of that. So I definitely think that you're going to like that if you like the sound of those things. A duology that is near and dear to my heart, that is the Raybearer duology by Jordan Ifueko. And this is just such a fresh and exciting YA fantasy that does not feel YA. It definitely has a maturity to it. It's a West African inspired fantasy duology that explores a really interesting type of government, but you're following a young girl who's raised by a chaotic goddess in order to assassinate the future emperor of the land. So we've got some interesting politics, but there is just so much going on in this. There is complex politics, there's self-discovery as far as like finding your identity, a coming of age sort of story. It's definitely filled with a lot of hope and new beginnings. There is some romance in there as well, but just the writing of this is so incredible. I really think it is an underrated series. I think for spring, it just is just full of life, and the world building is very rich, and I just think it really livens up the fantasy space. So I definitely think it feels like spring to me for those reasons, but definitely because it is a hope-filled story. Next up is one that I actually have a physical copy of. I've been trying to kind of put myself on a book buying ban and just be more intentional about purchases. But I do have a physical copy of this book because I absolutely love it. This is the first book of the Shadow of the Leviathan series, The Tainted Cup. I also love the sequel, A Drop of Corruption, maybe even a little bit more. But this is such an interesting fantasy where it's like Sherlock and Holmes in a fantasy world where there are like Leviathan beasts out in the ocean threatening to come and destroy the land. There is a very interesting and corrupt kind of empire with military. Our main characters are part of the military, and the thing that really makes this feel like spring, there's a lot of like rain and there's some really weird plant magic. So if you want something maybe a little bit on the creepier side of spring, this might do it for you. If you like the idea of like rainy days in spring, April showers bring May flowers, that whole sort of thing. I'm in Florida, so it rains all the time. But this definitely will be your thing. If you want fantasy and mystery that is really just gonna like rock your socks, I think this is definitely the series for you. The last book on my fantasy list is Shieldmaiden by Sharon Emmerichs. This is actually a Beowulf retelling, but it's like from the perspective of Beowulf's niece. We actually do see a little bit of Beowulf in the story, but this is such a interesting story where it's kind of a little bit YA leaning, but not in a bad way, but you're getting kind of a fresh take and new perspective on the sort of classic, kind of considered original fantasy story. So this definitely is navigating political and personal struggles, and we're kind of in a fortress run by a nobleman who is our main character, Frida's father. And this is definitely an exploration of like relationships and ambition and power, and how our main character, Frida, kind of is fitting into this community and trying to make a name for herself and find her place and purpose. I really liked the character work in this, but I feel like it's just a really great, fresh take on such a classic story like Beowulf. When I think of spring, I definitely think of cozy fantasy. I think sometimes when we think of cozy fantasy, it's like, oh, something that's like warm and rich, like maybe like Legends and Lattes, where it's like cozy and I want to be in a blanket and have like a hot mug of cocoa or coffee. But there is a part of like cozy fantasy that definitely feels like spring-like, where there's a lot of like plants and you're in gardens and the woods, and it feels very like bright and light and alive. And I think there are some really great stories in this kind of subcategory of cozy fantasy. So first up is Homegrown Magic by Jamie Pacton and Rebecca Podos. This is a queer kind of cozy fantasy with a romance at its core, and it is like two lost childhood friends lost connection and are reunited together, and how they're trying to like navigate, you know, kind of getting to know each other again with the responsibilities of their current lives kind of trying to pull them apart. But we have a witch who is a plant witch, and she just lives in this really like charming kind of countryside town, and that's where a lot of the story takes place. It is just really like bright and light. You feel like there's flowers just like growing out of your ears. It is just such a like fresh feeling story, and I really enjoy the romance in this. There's really like genuine connection. There is a decent amount of spice in here. I still feel like with that there is a really great relationship at the core. So if you want like cozy fantasy with plant magic, some witches, a runaway kind of rogue noble, and queer representation, I think this is going to be for you. Next up is The Teller of Small Fortunes by Julie Leung. This is a really like charming kind of cozy fantasy with sort of like a quest feeling story at its center. We're following our main character who can see the future and the kind of journey that she goes on with a ragtag gang that she kind of gets to know along the way. And it's definitely a story about like identity and self-discovery, acceptance and love and belonging. Our main character Tao definitely is going on a traveling journey, but also this journey of self-acceptance, and it's really just a beautiful story with a great found family at it. I felt like maybe it was a little bit long, but I still think it's a really great story, and I love the kind of quest feel of it, but it feels like this kind of bright, you know, sunlight, sun-drenched sort of like dirt paths, and you see the forests and plant life everywhere, and it just has kind of this bright quality to it. So a lot of hopeful messages and definitely some emotional depth to it, but I think it is perfect for spring in that it's just filled with like love and lightness and good messages. A cozy fantasy series that I've really come to love is the Cerulean Chronicles, or The House in the Cerulean Sea series by TJ Klune. We have 2 books out. This is an ongoing series. I believe there is a 3rd and final book that is supposed to come out. I don't think it's going to be any longer than that. But this is such an endearing series. I remember reading this first book and just absolutely falling in love with these characters. We are dealing with an orphanage that houses magical children that are different magical beings, and the social worker that comes to investigate. So it is just such a warm and endearing story. It's really funny a lot of the times. It will also hit you in the feels, and we just have some really special children in this story. But we also are kind of navigating the idea of being queer and how society has rejected the queer community, and we definitely explore it a lot more in the second book, but you definitely feel it in both books. But it's really just about self-acceptance and finding the people that you are at home with and this sort of found family feeling. So if you like the sound of that, a hopeful book, and we definitely have like kind of this bright light, almost leaning towards summer sort of feeling, but I definitely feel like this fits for spring. A magical forest, a magical like forest fairy being. There's a lot of just really like fun magic in here. So definitely think this is good for spring. Another series that feels like spring, summer, sort of like sun-drenched kind of story is The Maid and the Crocodile by Jordan Ifuko. And this actually is taking place after her Raybearer duology, but you could read this as a standalone. I personally feel like you should read the Raybearer duology first. You will get so much more out of it. But this is such a fascinating story. It is, again, a West African inspired story, but it is kind of inspired by Howl's Moving Castle. The author even said that was their inspiration. We have a young servant girl who becomes acquainted with a man who is also a crocodile. And it's just really warm and endearing. It definitely deals with like socioeconomic classes and definitely government and corruption in like really light terms. But this is kind of more of a romance at its core. But our main character really goes on a beautiful journey of like self-discovery and identity. I feel like that's kind of a theme for a lot of the books that I'm seeing with spring. You know, it's finding yourself, it's finding the purpose and hope in your life. And I think that's just perfect for spring. But this definitely has just a warm, rich sort of feel to it. And it's really a unique cozy fantasy that I think everybody needs to read. The Spellshop by Sarah Beth Durst is another unique cozy fantasy. We have a lot of plant magic in this one, but we're following a librarian who is having to escape her like city that she lives in. It is attacked, and then she escapes to the island where she grew up as a child, and how she kind of is integrating with the community and the interesting events that unfold. But she has a like sentient plant pet and we have interesting plant magic. We have like really like cozy shops in a small town, and it just has this really like sweet kind of springy vibe to it. It does have a little bit of a romance in there as well, but I feel like we're dealing with a little bit more of like some political issues, but also just kind of like dealing with the past, dealing with accepting ourselves, and becoming a part of a loving community. So another kind of hope-filled book, but it's just really sweet and cute, and I think it's a really fun time, but it still has some emotional depth to it. If you like a cozy fantasy with a quest in the story, you're definitely going to like this next one, Sword and Thistle by S.L. Rowland. This is a part of his Tales of Adria. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but it's part of his series of cozy fantasy books, kind of all in the same world. And I think he's a very underrated author. This is an enchanting cozy fantasy following the journey of Dobbin, a seasoned adventurer for hire, taking his last job. Dobbin is tasked with gathering rare mushrooms for an elite dinner club. It's a very interesting premise. But his mission leads him to a cursed land, and along the way he encounters a host of whimsical characters and magical creatures that add charm and richness to his quest. That is from my Goodreads review of this book. I think that perfectly sums up kind of just the premise of this. It's really a cozy take on a quest sort of story. There is a little bit of a romance in there. It's definitely like a subplot. I think it's just really charming, and I like our main character. He's kind of this seasoned sort of adventurer, but he really is just this kind character, and I really love the interactions that he has with the different people he meets along the way. So this just feels like a sweet and light kind of cozy fantasy that again is going to be perfect for spring. My next series is actually a graphic novel series, but do not write it off because it is absolutely adorable, precious, but beautiful with some emotional depth. That is the Tea Dragon Society series, and this is by Kate O'Neill. This is just really beautiful stories and clearly beautiful art that is cute as well as beautiful at the same time, but clearly you can see we got some spring vibes going on. But this is literally about these adorable little tea dragons that grow magically these tea leaves from their bodies, and it's about the people who are raising them and cultivating these tea leaves. So it really goes to like interesting places of exploring identity as far as within yourself, within a community, also like queer identity as well. But it really does it in such a sweet and just charming sort of way. But there are 3 books in here, and you go on an interesting journey with multiple characters. So you have like some reoccurring characters, but you get new characters with each book as well. So this is just a really interesting world that O'Neill has built out that is just really a beautiful kind of like escape that you can get into that just feels like you're diving into a forest with fresh flowers and some really sweet and endearing characters. Cozy. One of the first cozy fantasies that I ever read was Garden Spells by Sarah Addison Allen. And this is a little bit of an older story, but it is so good. This is kind of like practical magic, but I honestly enjoy this more than the original Practical Magic book, just as far as the writing style. But it is exploring a family of witches who deal with like growing herbs, and they have a magical apple tree in their yard. But it's about like estranged sisters kind of coming back together and dealing with the past and recommuning with each other and kind of tapping back into their magic. So there is a little bit of a romance in here as well, but it is just a really beautiful and heartwarming story. There's a really sweet community surrounding them, even though a lot of them kind of are ostracizing this family. There are people who are good to them, and they're just really sweet characters. We have definitely some trigger warnings in this one. There is like discussion of SA in here, so just be aware of that. But it definitely is a cozy story at its core. It definitely feels like fresh and almost, it's like spring, summer, I feel like would fit for either of those seasons. But you know, you have like the garden with all the herbs and plants and flowers and things like that. And it is just like, it's so like practical magic feeling that I think it's like if you want that, but you want like not the fall version, but a version that will fit for other seasons like spring and summer, then you're definitely going to enjoy this. The last book on my cozy fantasy list is actually kind of like sci-fi fantasy, but that is A Psalm for the Wild Build by Becky Chambers. This is a really cute story that has kind of a quest at its center, but we're following a monk and a robot who meet each other and kind of go on this journey together. And throughout their journey, they are kind of discussing life and their perspectives on what life is really about. And there's a little bit kind of a philosophical feel to this as far as the discussions that they have, but it's just really sweet and endearing, and it kind of gets you to think a little bit, but it's still very cozy. But we're in like these really lush forests. Everything feels a little bit overgrown, but very green and bright. And I think it's perfect for spring because of that. But I really love just the hope-filled messages within this book. All right, so those are my cozy fantasy. Let's get into some romance books. First up is Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. This is the first book of the series with the same name, and this is a rom-com, but it definitely has a deep emotional story to it. And there's even a tiny bit of fantasy in here, but it's just like a little sprinkling of it. It definitely is more of just a kind of classic rom-com, but it really has a unique story to it where we are dealing with people who are coming from really two different walks of life. We've got a small town guy who is practically the mayor of his small town, and then we've got a woman who is the daughter of this really well-known family in the medical field. She's a doctor. She's kind of being pressured to follow in her family's footsteps, but they end up having a one-night stand out of just kind of happening to meet each other, and they end up kind of building a genuine connection, but you know, their different walks of life are kind of trying to pull them apart. And it's like, how far are you willing to go for love? And, you know, what is it going to take to make things work? So it's definitely filled with heart and vulnerability and kind of like second chances on life. So there's definitely like a hope-filled sort of story in here, but it does have funny moments. It is still a rom-com, but I really like the exploration that each of the characters have for themselves, but also navigating the relationship and trying to find each other and the space for each other in their lives. So I think it really has like interesting and healthy discussions about relationship and connection. Sorry if the frame changed a little bit. I accidentally kicked the camera. Okay, so next is the quintessential, the classic, the queen of romance herself, and that is some Jane Austen. Pride and Prejudice is probably one of my favorite stories, favorite books of all time as far as romance goes. And I have probably watched the 2005 Pride and Prejudice movie uh, an embarrassing amount of times. I'll just say that. I love Jane Austen's writing. It is so special to me. But this is the romance story that really so many other romances are based on. But I think that many of her stories are applicable to spring and, just hope-filled sort of love stories. So Pride and Prejudice, I definitely recommend. Emma is definitely a great one for spring. And of course, Sense and Sensibility. And I definitely recommend looking up the movies and series attached with these if you haven't watched them. I think it's really good to kind of read and watch these in tandem. I'm trying to show you all of the books. I'm not doing very well. Okay. Here we go. We got the spines, spring colors. Okay, so definitely recommend these for spring, and not just because they are spring colors, but I think that these are just really hope-filled and classic romances that have stood the test of time for a reason because they're very, very good. I said I like fresh takes for spring, and this one is actually bouncing off of Pride and Prejudice because it is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, and that is Pride by Ibi Zoboi. This is by a Black author with Black characters, and it's kind of putting the Pride and Prejudice story in a modern and urban setting, and it is about these young teenagers navigating love, but we definitely have an Elizabeth and Darcy dynamic. But it is exploring identity and also just community within the Black community, and it really is a beautiful story. I really appreciated how it modernized the story and still stayed true to the beats of the story. So it makes it relatable, and I feel like is a really great way to diversify your readings, especially with romance, because it's a classic story that we know and love, but it's seeing it through characters that may look different from us. So I definitely recommend for diversifying your romance reads. A romance author that I have really come to enjoy is B.K. Borison. They recently put out a sequel to the book that I'm about to talk about, but First Time Caller is such a classic feeling, 2000s rom-com sort of feeling story. I feel like that has become sort of the sought out feeling as far as rom-com books go. But this is about a radio host who comes across a child calling in on behalf of their mother, trying to get them a date, basically. It feels very like Sleepless in Seattle, if you're familiar with that Tom Hanks, Meg Ryan movie. It's a classic, calling into the radio station, but it's a little bit of a twist because our main character kind of becomes part of the radio show. So it's really just sweet and endearing. I feel like I use those words a lot, but it really is kind of a fresh take on this sort of Sleepless in Seattle story. So I really love the nostalgia of the radio show. It feels, kind of 90s, 2000s sort of vibe to it where, you're calling into the radio show. But I really love the connection between our main characters, and they definitely have their own struggles that they're having to overcome. But I really think that they have a great connection, and I think it's really great for spring. If you like romance stories that are a little bit more irreverent, have a little bit more kind of humor that's maybe leading towards crass, but not in a bad way. It's more of just irreverent humor where we're not perfectly polished and just these sweet, perfect characters, maybe a little bit rough around the edges. But Funny Feelings by Tara DeWitt definitely fits that mold. And this is just such a fun story. It is about a female comedian and her male manager, and she has had a crush on him forever, but she keeps it professional. But it is just such a sweet romance. He is a single father with a young daughter, and just the dynamic that they kind of form together as this little three-person unit is just really sweet and special. But our main character, she is definitely irreverent with her humor, and she's a hilarious comedian, but it's kind of navigating that sort of dynamic of being a female comedian in kind of a male dominated field. And there's a little bit of fake dating in there. It's definitely a riot of a time, but it's still really sweet at its core. Next up is another great romance story that will diversify your reads, and that is Better Than Fiction by Alexa Martin. We have an interracial couple who have a really interesting connection as far as their sort of meet cute, if you want to call it that. And we have a bookseller who is kind of a cynic skeptic when it comes to love and romance, even though they're selling, books about love. And then we have an author who comes for a book signing at her store, and he is definitely a hopeless romantic. And so they kind of make this deal where they decide to investigate their surrounding area in Denver, Colorado, and kind of do what would be considered like the classic sort of romantic activities in a rom-com story as he's researching this area for his book. And he's trying to prove to her, that these sort of maybe considered cheesy things are actually purposeful and do have meaning, and you can find connection through them. And they just have a really interesting connection, and I really like the kind of journey they go on of getting to know each other through these different activities. It may sound a little bit trite, but it definitely doesn't feel that way in the story. And I really like the kind of side characters in this as well. They definitely add to it. They do everything from river rafting to doing local restaurants. And there definitely are some messy family ties and drama within this as well. So there's a lot going on, but I think it is a very fresh take for a romance story, and I really appreciate the representation. Next up is my first and only Ali Hazelwood book that I've read, but that is Love on the Brain, and I really enjoy this story. I think some people say they like The Love Hypothesis more. I just haven't read it yet, so I don't know. But this is a women in STEM kind of based rom-com where we are following characters who work at NASA. But our female main character runs into her arch enemy from grad school who happens to be working in the same place at NASA with her. So it's about them reconnecting, but the male main character, I thought he was just totally down bad for the FMC. And I think that it's just really sweet. And I think that it does get a little bit silly in certain parts, but I think that it makes it just a fun kind of light story. But I do like the connection and kind of overcoming past prejudices that they do as far as reconnecting, getting to know each other again. So if you like the idea of science nerds falling in love that used to be arch enemies, then I think you'll like this one. Another kind of nerdy, geeky love story is Love and Other Conspiracies by Mallory Marlowe. This is about a woman who works at kind of a BuzzFeed social media conglomerate, whatever you want to call it. And she's trying to find the next new show so she can keep her job. She comes across this man who hosts a podcast about conspiracy theories like UFOs and cryptids and that sort of thing. So it has a little bit of this silliness to it. She's a total skeptic, but she thinks that he does the show really well. And so she tries to convince him to turn it into a video series, and they decide to kind of produce the show together. And this one, it surprisingly has this emotional depth to it as far as exploring your past and maybe family issues, accepting yourself, and it just really has this great romance to it that really surprised me because the premise sounded totally silly, but it just kind of keeps it fun and light, even though it does have this emotional depth to it. But I think if you want something that's just really fun, that has a little bit of like Bigfoot and that kind of nerdiness to it, I think you will really like this. It is a fresh rom-com that I think is great for all year round, but I think you'll like it for spring. I am a big Emily Henry fan, and a lot of her books kind of take place during summer, but I feel like this next one feels like spring, maybe a little bit summery, and that is Funny Story. And this is about a pair who have been dumped and they don't have anywhere to live because their partners kind of kick them out, and so they decide to become roommates. And then they find out that their exes are actually dating each other. It is definitely a funny story in that it is like a little bit chaotic and complicated, but it definitely has kind of like the vibes of like the show New Girl, if you're familiar with that, with Zooey Deschanel. Our main male character definitely feels like Nick from the show, if you're familiar with it. He's kind of like rough and grungy, a stoner, that kind of thing. And she is a librarian, but they just have kind of this unlikely connection. But we are kind of fake dating. There is like farmers markets, and it just feels like this kind of light, fresh, springy kind of rom-com story. So if you want something that's a little bit different, a little bit irreverent as well, but you like the idea of, you know, something that feels springy with like, you know, markets and farmers markets. You get a little bit of the library as well. There's just something about this that feels like spring to me, and I think it's just that it's kind of a fresh take on a rom-com story. Next is another Pride and Prejudice retelling, but this is dealing with queer identity and being a trans person. I thought this was such a great retelling. It's a part of a whole series of like these kind of classic retellings. It's called Remixed Classics. This is by Gabe Cole Novoa, and it's exploring queer identity in that our main character, Elizabeth, is actually identifying as a man, Oliver. And they are still like dead named Elizabeth, their gender from birth, but it's navigating society in this like Regency period as a queer person. It does have some historical context for what the kind of like very hidden underground queer community would have been like back then, but I feel like it does a really great job of exploring the thoughts and the mind of a trans person and what their experience is like. It was definitely eye-opening for me, and I really appreciated just like the care and emotional honesty of this story. And I think it is really special because it's taking, again, a classic story, but using it to communicate experiences that may be different from yours. But I also think someone who's trans, I think, would maybe find this very endearing and something that they can identify with. But I think it's really important that people who are not trans read this and gain some understanding about the trans community. We also have other queer representation in here as well, but I just really appreciated the romance in here and the connection and, again, exploring of self-identity. I definitely liked the representation here and the exploration of what that experience is like. So definitely a fresh take on a classic romance story. My last romance on this list is one that is a little bit different, and that is The Good Part by Sophie Cousins. This is different because we have a little bit of time travel in here. So we have our main character, Lucy Young, and she is tired of like being like the coffee runner at her TV production job. And she's tired of like the disastrous dates she goes on. She's tired of her nasty flat that she lives in. She's tired of life. So she accidentally comes across this magical wishing machine, and she makes a wish: please let me skip to the good part of my life. And she wakes up and she has a totally different life. She wakes up next to this handsome man. There's a ring on her finger, high-powered job. She's got a little boy and a baby girl. Her life is just totally different. So this is like skipping forward, and she's now like 40 rather than 26. So she's kind of dealing with like, okay, I've missed this part of my life. I'm trying to navigate being in this totally unfamiliar part of my life. She's embracing this new life and new relationships, but she's kind of like, okay, can I go back to my former life? And would I want to do that? It's like, you know, is it okay to just like skip to the good part without the journey of getting there? It really has some interesting like philosophical discussions, but it is a romance at its heart, but it definitely is an interesting take on a kind of rom-com story. I love time travel in a romance story. I think it brings something really cool and unique, and I think that it is a fresh take for spring. All right, we are chugging along, and we are at our last big category before we get to poetry, and that is fantasy romance. And we're starting off with A Legionnaire's Guide to Love and Peace by Emily Strutsky. And this is definitely an interesting story. We are in a military troop, an army that is getting ready to basically go to battle. We believe that we're going to die in battle, so these two characters, our main characters, decide to have like this kind of last night, one night stand because they're gonna die the next day, is what they think. So we have our one night stand, and the battle happens, and then we survive. So they have to navigate what life is going to be, what is their relationship now that they've survived, but also navigating kind of the military political situation that is around them as well. So a very unique kind of fantasy romance in its premise and plot. We also are set in a queer, normative, and gender equal world. And I feel like it just has this really great story of like a friendship budding into a romance. I feel like it's definitely full of heart, definitely a lot of humor, and kind of this slow burn connection. But I feel like the romance is never really overshadowed by the stakes of the war. It's kind of like they coexist together, and I feel like it's balanced really well. So if you want something that is a little bit different as far as fantasy romance goes with like kind of a military theme, then I think you're gonna like this one. A fantasy romance story that is like none that I have read, that I fell in love with last year, is The Everlasting by Alex E. Harrow. This is my first read from this author, and I am definitely going to be reading more of them. This is such a special, special book. We are following a lady knight who is studied throughout history, and she is kind of in this like older medieval time period, and we are following the scholar in the present day who his life work has been studying her. This definitely is a time travel kind of romance, a romance across eras. I don't want to give too much away about it, but it is definitely a fresh take. And I feel like this uses time travel in such a unique way to explore the idea of history and who is controlling the narrative and who is this narrative benefiting as far as the retelling of history. And the romance in here is definitely beautiful, but I think the messages and kind of discussion about history and the political situation in here, they're balanced well. I feel like they have equal weight, but the romance in here is just incredible. So Lady Knight, a nerdy scholar, definitely a queer identity in here, but it's so good. It's so incredible. I had to have this for my shelf, and I just can't say enough about it. So definitely you need to read The Everlasting. I have another graphic novel for you in the fantasy romance category, and that is The Prince and the Dressmaker by Jen Wang. This is a really cute story that is exploring relationships with queer identity, but it's just so like sweet and endearing, and I absolutely love it. This is about Prince Sebastian, who is looking for a bride, but really it's his parents looking for a bride for him. But Sebastian is too busy hiding his secret from everyone. At night, he puts on daring dresses and takes Paris by storm as the fabulous Lady Crystalia. And it is about his best friend, who is a dressmaker, and the only person that really knows his kind of secret, that he likes to wear these dresses and put on this whole persona. They just have such a sweet and beautiful connection of acceptance and just understanding each other. There really is a friendship at the core of it. It is just so like, ugh, I love this story. It is so cute. I really like the art in this. It's just really special. It's a really short read, it being a graphic novel. I really love the art in this, but it will just steal your heart. It is this sweet kind of fairy tale feeling story. I feel like I've said sweet probably too many times, but I definitely think this is a great fresh take for fantasy romance for spring. If you want a fun, feel good time, a just romp, chaotic kind of story when it comes to fantasy romance, and you like the idea of like a historical fiction fantasy romance, you definitely need to read India Holton's books. So first off, we have the Dangerous Damsel series. I've only read 2 books, but my favorite is the Wisteria Society of Lady Scoundrels, the first book. Absolutely loved it. So funny. It is chaotic. It is such a fun time. We're following a lady thief who is part of this like ladies group of criminals and they have these like flying houses, and she is trying to run away from this crazed pirate and his dangerously charming henchman. And the henchman and our main character Cecilia, you know, maybe form an attachment. But it is so chaotic. It is like these crime bosses, basically, these female crime bosses and pirates, and we have houses that fly instead of ships. And it's very British, it's very chaotic, it is very funny. It's kind of like tongue-in-cheek humor. There's a little bit of like innuendo humor as well, but I think it's done in just a kind of light and humorous way. So if you like the sound of something chaotic like that, I would definitely recommend. And then there also is her other series, the Love's Academic series, starting with the Ornithologist Field Guide to Love. And then there's also the Geographer's Map of Romance to Romance. And then the third book is coming out April 21st of this year, and that is The Antiquarian's Object of Desire. But getting back to the first book, which is the one that I have read, Ornithologist Field Guide to Love, we're literally following scholars of birds who have attended these prestigious universities like Cambridge and Yale, but we are kind of these scholarly rivals, and we end up on this journey to find this rare bird. And it's like this competition, cutthroat competition to find this bird. It is a kind of trek across the UK. It is so crazy and hilarious. It's kind of nerdy because we have these birds, but there's like some magical birds in here as well. And it's just a really fun time, but it's definitely nerdy. And I think that if you like the idea of like nerdy scholars finding love, and they're in competition with each other, but they just, maybe we should just keep traveling together. That's the feel that this has. So I definitely think that it is really funny, and I love her tongue-in-cheek kind of humor. And I definitely think you should check out India Holton's books. I love a pirate story, I love cozy fantasy, and I love fantasy romance. This next book kind of has all of that wrapped into one, and that is Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This is his take on a cozy fantasy story. This is a standalone of his like special projects. I don't consider this like my favorite book as far as fantasy romance, but I know a lot of people really love it, and I think it is definitely worth reading. And we are basically following kind of a princess bride sort of narrative, but instead we have our female main character going to save the male main character, who is this prince that has been shipped away by his evil king father. And the young girl that he has fallen in love with, she goes on this journey to recover our prince. And it is definitely a quirky, kind of weird sort of story. We have these magical spores that are, threatening to like poison us, and it's definitely got an interesting premise to it. But we are sailing the high seas with a gang of pirates. We have a talking rat companion. There's a lot going on in this, but I think it does have some great humor in here and a sweet romance. The romance isn't super heavy. I feel like this is like cozy fantasy with some romance, but I put it in the romance category because it very much follows the romantic princess bride narrative. So I think this is really sweet and fun and definitely an interesting take for a fantasy romance. I have another time traveling romance for you, and I'm putting it in the fantasy romance category because of the time travel magical aspect of it. This is The Magic of Lemon Drop Pie by Rachel Linden. This is a really sweet book, and this is about a heartbroken young pie maker who was granted a magical second chance to live the life she didn't choose. And this is like following like her mother dying. She died 10 years ago. And then she broke up with her first love and then abandoned her dream of opening a restaurant in order to keep her family's struggling Seattle diner afloat and care for her younger sister and grieving father. So it's like, okay, what would my life be like if it maybe went this way? We have 3 lemon drops, each allow her to live a single day in a life that might have been hers. So it feels a little bit like A Christmas Carol, and not like completely, but it's like, getting these 3 different chances, 3 different perspectives, seeing the past. And it's a really unique story. I think it's really an interesting exploration of like the what ifs, and is it really even worth exploring those things? But it is a romance at its core, and I think it is just really sweet. It's surprising and empowering, I think, as far as a romance story goes. So it's got a cozy feel to it, but it feels light and bright. We've got lemon pie, and if you just look at the cover itself, this looks very spring. This very much captures the vibe of the feel of this story. So that is A Magic of Lemon Drop Pie. Last on my fantasy romance list is Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. I have seen this qualified as cozy fantasy as well. I think you could say this is, a cozy fantasy romance. It definitely is romance forward, but we are following a young woman who has lost half of her soul to an evil fae, and she kind of has to navigate the world with not really processing emotions like the rest of the people around her. So we are in like Regency England, and this girl happens upon the sorcerer, the magician of the court, and he definitely is opening her eyes to a world that she didn't know. And this is like, he definitely, our main male character has very like Howl's Moving Castle, like Howl the character vibes. And I really just love the romance in here. It does get a little bit kind of trippy when we get into like the Fae realm. It feels a little bit Alice in Wonderland, if that doesn't give you enough of a picture. But I really love this being in like Regency England, this kind of historical romance as well. It just is really sweet, but it also has some social commentary talking about how the poor were treated during this time, the corrupt structure of socioeconomic classes. So I really think that this is a special book in that it's romantic, it's sweet, but it has genuine connection and really important messages. And I think it explores a topic of history that I think is really important and still very relevant. So I think this is a really great read if you want something that is like a historical fiction fantasy romance. All right, really quickly, let's talk about some poetry. First up is E. Cummings' selected poems. I personally like this collection. This is just really interesting poetry. It is formatted in really unique ways that make you kind of think about words and phrasing in a new way. This clearly has like a springy vibe to it, but I think E. Cummings' poetry is very unique in how he just explores words and phrasing structure, and he explores a lot of different topics from life and death and love. And I really think that it's a short read but an interesting read. I really like poured over this one summer in college, and I just thought it was a really special experience. I think if you're looking for some poetry, this is definitely one to check out. And of course, I think you need to read the classic poems of Emily Dickinson. This is a little bit of a thicker read, but this is just kind of a collection of her poems. I think reading her poems, it's really like studying the human soul, and you're exploring love and death and life, and definitely like her isolation that she lived in, definitely examining society. There's a lot that she covers, but there's just this very like concise way that she speaks, and I think that it's fresh poetry from the time period that she was in, but I feel like it's still very relevant for today. And yeah, if you haven't read Emily Dickinson, you just really need to, because I think her poetry is like no other. Even if you aren't a poetry person, studying her poetry and kind of, maybe getting a little bit of a backstory about them, learning the meanings behind them, I think is really eye-opening and very educational. Okay, guys, we have got to the end of this list. I hope that I gave you plenty to dig into and read. I feel like this was a pretty extensive list, but these are all books that just feel like spring to me. So maybe they don't to you, and that's totally okay. And if you've read any of them and they feel like spring to you, I definitely want to know. But let's definitely talk about these books, and if any of them interested you, definitely let me know. I love knowing that I am giving you a recommendation and that you are enjoying it, but I definitely want to hear your takes if you have read these books. So guys, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so glad to be back with you and making some content, and hopefully we will keep this on a roll for the month of March. But again, I hope that you enjoyed this. Leave me a little flower emoji if you made it to the end of the video, and I will see you guys soon. Bye.